Topic 49A, the Civil Rights Movement through Brown v. Board of Education, 1954. You should take notes during this podcast, pause it as necessary, and listen to it as many times as you need to, as you will need them to complete future graded assignments. I recommend that you take notes in the Cornell method of note-taking as presented in Podcast 3 of this course. By the end of this podcast, you should be able to explain why the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s emerged when it did, and understand the importance of Brown v. Board of Education in ending constitutionally sanctioned segregation. When many Americans hear the phrase, the civil rights movement, they think automatically and only of this man. While Martin Luther King Jr. was an important leader in African Americans' fight for civil rights, he was not the only or even the first such figure. In many ways, the fight for civil rights stretches back to the era when African Americans were still enslaved, when courageous escapees like Frederick Douglass and Harriet Tubman wrote, spoke, and led their sisters and brothers to freedom. During the dark days of Jim Crow, Booker T. Washington advocated for economic opportunities, while W.E.B. Du Bois campaigned for full political citizenship for African Americans. In 1941, Union leader A. Philip Randolph used President Franklin Roosevelt's need for steady war material production and his friendship with First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, herself a loyal supporter of civil rights, to pressure the president into desegregating war industries by executive order. So, if there were so many dedicated fighters for civil rights stretching back at least a century, why do we associate the civil rights movement only with Martin Luther King in the 1950s and 60s? In short, there are two main reasons for that association. First, because these decades brought the struggles of African Americans for civil rights to the attention of the majority of Americans who were white. The public face of that struggle was Dr. King. Second, because the efforts of Black Americans, especially between 1954 and 65, led to monumental legal changes in the U.S. And while those laws and court cases have not always translated into concrete changes in the lived experiences of people of color during the ensuing decades, they did represent an important break with almost a century of segregation and lay crucial groundwork for legal battles in the future. The modern movement for civil rights in the United States begins in 1954 with the Supreme Court's decision in Brown v. Board of Education. And though the Board of Ed in this case was located right in the center of the U.S. in Topeka, Kansas, the justices' opinions were influenced by current events around the globe. As discussed in Podcast 47B, after World War II, countries like India began to declare independence from their colonial masters in Europe. As the U.S. fought for the allegiance of these formerly subjugated colonies, domestic racism hurt America's image in its Cold War against the Soviet Union. Moreover, many African Americans had fought valiantly during World War II, and increasingly demanded equal treatment from the government and other citizens. So, around 1950, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or the NAACP, began searching for plaintiffs who could challenge the nation's system of segregation, which had been declared constitutional with the 1896 Supreme Court case of Plessy v. Ferguson. It found these plaintiffs in the 13 parents in Topeka, headed by Oliver Brown, father of third grader Linda, who was forced to attend a quote-unquote black school 1 mile from her home, despite the existence of a quote-unquote white school 7 blocks from her home. Interestingly, The plaintiffs did not allege inferior or even substantially different physical facilities, curriculum, or teachers at the all-black school. Eventually, after the case made its way through lower courts, the highest court of the land agreed with the plaintiffs, arguing unanimously that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal and violated the 14th Amendment's promise of equal protection. However, the original Brown case failed to outline how desegregation of schools should be accomplished, and a second Brown case only declared that states should desegregate their schools with all deliberate speed. In the next podcast, we'll learn about the impact of the Brown decision on efforts to extend desegregation throughout the South and North through the 1970s. For now, write out each learning objective in a sentence or a paragraph. If you find that you cannot do so, go back to the beginning of the podcast, listen and watch again, and pause it as necessary to supplement the notes you've already taken until you can easily answer all of the learning objectives. Good luck!